Yes, sir. So first, starting with jejunal-ileal atresia, it is the most common congenital anomaly of small intestine. Atresia is accounting for 95% and stenosis for 5% of the anomaly. Prevalence is around 2.9 per 10,000 live births, more common in African American children and twins, and there is equal prevalence in boys and girls. Also, it has been seen that it is associated with increased risk with use of, like there is increased risk with use of pseudoephedrine, with especially if it is taken with acetaminophen, ergotamine, and caffeine for migraine headaches during pregnancy. Also seen in infants with low birth weight. Generally, multiple atresias are seen in such babies, and it may rarely coexist with other atresias as well. So, etiology, the perturbating events occur later in utero. So, late intrauterine mesenteric vascular occlusions are the most common and proven etiological factor for small bowel atresia. These can happen because of volvulus, intussusception, internal hernia, or a tight anterior abdominal wall defect. So, because of these vascular incidents, there will be critical ischemia, which will lead to irreversible changes, and finally disintegration and causing atritic segment. So, other causes seen are iatrogenic postpartum ileal atresia. This can happen in cases of occult omphaloceal. Then there could be placental vascular anomalies, or it could be familial as well. So, Mr. Shorter described five distinct types of familial atresia which are dated till date or which have been seen till date. So, the five most common ones are the pyloric atresia, duodenal atresia, multiple atresia syndrome in which rotation is generally seen, apple peel atresia or proximal atresia at the duodenojejunal junction, and most of these are autosomal recessive, and colonic atresia, which is seen in sigmoid colon or descending colon, it is X-linked recessive. These are the familial cases known. So, coming to the presentation of small bowel atresias, in the history we'll find most common associated maternal polyhydramnios. And postnatally, child will present with bilious emesis, abdominal distension, which is mainly seen 12 around 8 to 12 hours post birth. There will be failure to pass meconium and on day one, and there will be jaundice, which is because of elevation of indirect hyperbilirubin. Prenatal imaging, ultrasound is there, but ultrasound is suggested in all mothers with polyhydramnios. But for GI abnormalities, it is unreliable because it has a relatively poor predictive value and it generally does not affect the outcomes. So, in case of ambiguity or a doubt, we should go ahead with fetal MRI. Like this is the picture of a fetal MRI, which is showing multiple dilated small bowel loops and no meconium, which is suggestive of a distal bowel obstruction. Postnatally, once the child is born, most important investigation is a plain abdominal X-ray. Supine and lateral decubitus should be taken. In an atritic bowel, we'll see thumb-sized interstitial loops. There will be air fluid levels. There will be absence of distal gas, distal to the atritic segment. There could be peritoneal calcifications or intraluminal calcifications. If we do a contrast enema, it will tell us the position of the colon, and because of proximal atresia, the colon will be small and unused, that is microcolon. So this is an X-ray image. The left X-ray shows us small bowel obstruction. Then the contrast enema done in the same child shows an unused microcolon. The cecum is drawn up to the right side, so may be associated with partial malrotation. And intra of the same child was found to have ileal atresia. This is again another example which is showing distal ileal atresia. The X-ray we can see multiple dilated bowel loops with one significant dilated loop. In the contrast enema, colon is more or less of the good size, but there is no reflex of contrast in the proximal small bowel. And this was an intra pic of this baby, which is showing distal ileal atresia. Definitive pre-op diagnosis is not always possible in children with small bowel obstruction. Apart from atresias, there could be malrotation and volvulus. In fact, malrotation is observed in 10% of patients with jejunal atresia. There could be meconium ileus, intestinal duplication, internal hernia, colonic atresia, adynamic ileus secondary to sepsis, or it could even be total colonic aganglionosis. So pathologically, we have seen that it is the jejunal atresia are equally distributed between the jejunum and the ileum. So Lowe and Bernard were the first one to classify them. They classified into three different types. Type 1 according to them was a mucosal or septal atresia. Type 2 was where two atretic blind ends were there connected by a fibrous cord. And type 3 was a V-shaped gap in the mesentery. The contemporary classification which we follow was revised first by Martin and then Grossfeld and colleagues. They added two more categories. One was multiple atresias, which is seen in 6 to 20%. It was given staging of stage type 4, and apple peel or Christmas tree deformity, which is seen in 11 to 32%. It is classified as 3B. So this is what I was referring, the classification of jejunal atresia. Type 1, we see the mucosal continuity is maintained. In type 2, there is a fibrous cord connecting the two proximal and distal part of the atresia. Type 3A, there is a V-shaped mesenteric defect. Type 3B is apple peel or Christmas tree deformity, which is associated with the foreshortened bowel length and foreshortened mesentery. It is associated with poor prognosis. And type 4 is multiple or sausage shaped atresia. This is a photograph taken from colon only, which is showing apple peel deformity on the left side, and right side there are multiple atresias. The prognostic factors in the case of this small bowel atresias are prematurity, any association of congenital anomalies. Just to mention, like Down syndrome, as we know, it is generally seen in association with duodenal atresia, like 30% of duodenal atresias, but it is uncommon in jejunal atresia. Delayed diagnosis will have a poor prognostic implication, and survival is definitely better in ileal than jejunal atresia, and associated short bowel syndrome post surgery. Surgery is the mainstay of this condition, and directly before going to surgery, pre-op stabilization of the baby is very important. So we have to take care of proximal gastric and intestinal decompression by putting in an NG tube. This will also prevent aspiration. Fluid should be maintained. Any deficiency or ongoing losses should be replaced. X-ray and contrast enema should be done beforehand. Any hematological or biochemical abnormality should be corrected, and prophylactic antibiotics should be started. The principles of surgery depends upon the type of atresia. We should make sure that intraoperatively we examine the whole length of bowel, and we check the patency of distal, large bowel and small bowel. Any ischemic or twisted bowel should be untwisted, and we can delay the anastomosis for 24 hours, and we can go in and recheck again the assess the viability of the bowel. By this way, we can save as much bowel length as possible. And back resection of the proximal dilated bowel with primary anastomosis, with or without tapering or plication of the proximal dilated loop, is a preferred operative approach. The residual bowel length must be documented. This is important for the post-op management. And if there is a suspicion or the child might go into short bowel syndrome, bowel lengthening procedure should be attempted. So incision, generally we give right transverse upper abdomen incision. We will explore whole of the bowel should be delivered out. We should look for any malrotation or multiple atresias should be detected. So after detection of all the atretic areas, they are resected. As I told, proximal we go for back resection, and it's generally a 90-degree resection, and the distal end we go for oblique. So after that, uh, we will unite the mesenteric borders and anastomosis. There are two techniques of anastomosis. Either it's end to oblique anastomosis. Either it's Benson or Nixon. Difference is Benson is single layer anastomosis. Nixon is a double layer anastomosis with the cheetles on the distal side because there is huge discrepancy in the diameter of the bowel. Then this is very important to close the mesenteric gap followed by abdominal wound closure. Bowel saving procedures which we can attempt is either a tapering enteroplasty, or we can go ahead with the plication or enfolding enteroplasty. Another option is anti-mesenteric seromuscular stripping and inversion plication. In case of multiple atresias, all these procedures can be combined wherever possible enteroplasty, and wherever bowel is unhealthy or there are multiple atresias with in a small gap, we can do resection anastomosis. Coming to the post-op care, adequate hydration is very important for these babies. We should try that they should have a good urine output about 1.5 to 2 ml per kg per hour. After that, slow introduction of enteral feeds should be given. If during the initial phase we are not able to provide any enteral feeds, we can also go ahead with the total parenteral nutrition. And we should keep in mind that distal ileal resection babies will have malabsorption, especially related to fat, bile salts, vitamin B12, calcium, and magnesium. Complications seen are that with any bowel resection anastomosis, that is anastomotic leak, stricture formation, ischemia of the residual bowel. There could be functional or adhesive obstruction. There could be short bowel syndrome, and post-op infections related to pneumonia, peritonitis, or sepsis. Outcomes of this surgery has evolved over the past few decades. So now we see a good survival. It approaches more than 95% in all types of ecthysias, and mortality rate is maximum with the type 3 and 3b multiple ecthysias, apple peel. They are seen to have maximum mortality. Coming to our experience, I'll just mention one or two cases which we have seen recently during the COVID times. This was a baby which was antenatally detected to have a double bubble. Um, on ultrasound, it was detected. Baby was referred to us on day two only, and we also suspected query duodenal atresia or query proximal bowel atresia. On exploration, what we found was an apple peel deformity. In the rightmost picture, this is after disconnecting, after opening the proximal jejunum, we checked for distal patency, and finally, duodenojejunal anastomosis was done. Post-operatively, child required intensive care, and it took almost 20 to 30 days for child's bowel to start working again. And after that, child was discharged and the baby was stable. Sir, anything we'll discuss for this? So, shall I go ahead with the next topic, meconium ileus?
Hello, Ronnie.
Yes, sir.
I think go ahead and then we will discuss it at the last one.
Okay, sure, sir. So next topic is meconium ileus. So before going into details, I'll tell you about the recent cases that we saw. Uh, this was a day 4 male child, antenatal normal, full term normal vaginal delivery, and referred to us because it didn't pass meconium for 3 days. So after coming here, after rectal stimulation, child passed motion. There was no definite blast sign or anything, but child passed motion and it was washes dependent. This was the initial X-ray where we can see dilated bowel loops. Then we went ahead with the contrast study. So on contrast enema, it was looking like we suspected total colonic A ganglionosis. Almost the entire length of colon is like a microcolon. As child was washes dependent, we took this baby up for take with keeping in mind that we'll do leveling biopsy and stoma. We took this baby up. Intra, what we found was a distinct transition zone, 25 centimeter proximal to the IC junction, and from there we made the stoma and we took multiple leveling biopsies. Surprisingly, when the biopsy reports came, all the reports were aganglionated. Sorry, all the reports were ganglionated. So we did a rectal biopsy that was also ganglionated. So finally, we went ahead and we asked our co-PGs to send a cystic fibrosis gene analysis. So they did a serum trypsinogen genetic analysis and it came out positive for this child. So it is cystic fibrosis positive. So finally, we gave the diagnosis of meconium ileus. And now next week, we are planning to do a Bishop-Koop procedure for this baby. This was a second child which we saw. This was also during the COVID times. Unfortunately, we lost this baby. This had presented to us on day 2, male child, antenatally was normal, birth weight was on the lower side, 1.8 kg, and had not passed meconium. On X-ray, we could clinically we could palpate abdominal mass, and on X-ray also there was suspicion of meconium pseudocyst. So this child was taken up for after stabilization. This child was taken up for procedure. Intra, there were dense adhesion scenes, and the blind ending of the ileum into the cyst was seen. But there was too much of bleeding intraop and child was unstable, so finally it was closed. And later on in the NICU, I think in a couple of hours, the baby succumbed to death. So with this background, I'll start my discussion for meconium ileus. It is the commonest cause of prenatal intrauterine intestinal perforation. So Landsteiner was the first one which described and related it to the pathological changes noted in the pancreas. Then it was Anderson who described the relationship of histological likeness of pancreatic abnormalities in both meconium ileus and cystic fibrosis. And he described meconium ileus as an early and more severe manifestation of the overall lung and pancreatic insufficiency. So, coming to the genetics, the genetic mutation lies in a cell membrane protein, which is CFTR, cystic fibrosis transmembrane regulator. Cystic fibrosis is an autosomal recessive disease. Its incidence is 1 per 1150 to 2500 live births in whites. It is rare in blacks and almost unheard of in Asians and Africans. And it is one of the earliest clinical manifestation of cystic fibrosis. Sorry, meconium ileus has been reported as a presenting feature in around 20% of the cystic fibrosis population. So I was telling cystic fibrosis transmembrane regulator gene, which is responsible. It was first identified by Francis Collins. So this gene lies on chromosome 7, long arm, 31 band, and it encodes a cyclic cyclic AMP induced chloride channel, which regulates ion flow across the apical surface of epithelial cells. And the tubular structures which are lined by such affected epithelia, they are characterized by desiccation and reduced clearance of their secretions. And the most common systems which are affected include respiratory system, GI, biliary, pancreatic, and reproductive systems. Most common mutation in many of the CFTR gene locations is F508, which is seen in 50% of patients. And the clinical correlate of this pathophysiology goes like this. Pancreatic insufficiency is seen in almost 90% of patients, meconium ileus in 10 to 20%, diabetes mellitus 20%, obstructive biliary disease in 15 to 20%, and azoospermia in nearly 100%. Coming to the pathogenesis, So, defect of cystic fibrosis is basically an exocrine eccrine gland dysfunction, particularly of the mucus secreting and sweat glands. So, there are two simultaneous pathological events which appear in utero, and this results in an intraluminal accumulation of highly viscid and tenacious meconium. So those two events are: first, development of pancreatic exocrine enzyme deficiency, and secretion of hyperviscous mucus by pathological abnormal intestinal glands. So the intestinal glandular abnormality leads to a meconium with a variable composition than in normal neonates. So in such babies, concentration of sodium, potassium and magnesium are almost twice as high in meconium. The enzyme catalyzing heavy metals are low. It contains greater amounts of protein, nitrogen, and lesser amounts of carbs. Carbohydrates contain abnormal mucoproteins. And one more thing observed is most of the protein is albumin, and it is expected to be of plasma origin. This albumin reacts with mucopolysaccharides and imparts that characteristic viscid, highly viscid and rubbery character to the involved secretions. And this leads to thickened meconium, which will accumulate in utero, and it will obstruct the intestine lumen, resulting in the dilatation of the proximal ileum. Its wall will thicken and will be filled with this tenacious and tarry meconium. Whereas distally, the bowel will be narrowed, and at times the colon may contain beaded or boxcar concretions of grey white putty like inspissated meconium. And more distal colon is small or unused, that is a microcolon. So meconium ileus can either present as simple or uncomplicated, or it can be associated with complications like which can happen in utero or it can happen postnatal as well, which are namely volvulus, perforation with meconium peritonitis, necrosis of the bowel with atresia, meconium pseudocyst. And another important entity in older children or young adult, the presentation is like meconium ileus equivalent, which we also call as distal ileal obstruction syndrome. So clinical presentation in simple meconium ileus is immediately at birth child will present with abdominal distension. In fact, meconium ileus is the only variety of neonatal intestinal obstruction that produces abdominal distension at birth before the neonate has even swallowed air. There could be bilious vomiting and failure to pass meconium. Whereas in complicated meconium ileus, it may, as I told before, it can present either in utero or postnatally. There will be evidence of bowel obstruction, complicated by previous intestinal perforation or necrosis, or on clinical assessment, there may be evidence of peritonitis. On physical examination, there will be distended bowel, distended abdomen, visible peristaltic waves can be made out. Uh, because of the inspissated meconium, palpable doughy bowel loops will be there. Rectal examination more or less is unremarkable, but spontaneous expulsion of meconium does not happen. And in the presence of an in utero perforation with meconium peritonitis and cyst, or more correctly called pseudocyst formation, we can feel a palpable abdominal mass, discoloration of the abdominal wall, and signs of peritoneal irritation. Radiological study in utero, we can, on ultrasound, we can maximum make out meconium dilated bowel loop or echogenic bowel wall in the third trimester. That might help us clinch to the diagnosis. After delivery in an uncomplicated meconium ileus, first investigation should be a plain X-ray abdomen. And that we see three important points. First is there will be great disparity in the size of intestinal loops. Second, there will be no or few air fluid levels. This is because swallowed air cannot layer over the thickened meconium. And third important is granular or soap bubble or ground glass appearance, which is more commonly seen on the right side of abdomen, which is because of whatever little air bubbles child had swallowed, it will intermix with that sticky meconium. Next important investigation is contrast edema. First of all, it will tell us the position of the colon, that if there is any associated malrotation or not. The small unused colon will be seen as a microcolon, and then we can make out pellets of inspissated meconium. And we can also, if there is a reflux of the contrast into the ileum, we can see the proximal dilated loops and meconium pellets as well. Laboratory testing. Most important is the sweat test. Sweat is collected from the infant's forearm, leg, or back, and the concentration of sodium and chloride is measured in the sample. Now, important points for this test are that minimum amount of sweat to be collected is 100 mg, and a measured concentration of chloride in excess of 60 milliequivalents per liter is diagnostic. But generally, the children, normal neonates sometimes also have increased sweat, sodium, and chloride, and therefore we defer. And it is difficulty in collecting so much of sweat, so we generally defer application of this test until neonate reaches several weeks of age. Other tests available are genetic testing, in which we can analyze the DNA for CFTR. And if a family has known CFTR mutations, then amniocentesis with fetal DNA restriction fragment length polymorphism, that is RFLP analysis, may predict fetal diagnosis. And also this albumin, as I told, albumin concentrations are high. The pathophysiological alteration of an increased albumin concentration in meconium, that is albumin in excess of 20 mg per gram, is also used as a screening method. Other options are stool trypsin and chymotrypsin analysis. A trypsin level less than 80 milligrams per gram of stool coupled with the operative findings. So the operative tissue specimens which generally we'll send is either intestinal, rectal or appendiceal. It is the pathognomic changes seen include goblet cell hyperplasia and accumulation of secretions within the crypts or within the lumen. Now coming to the next important aspect is the DD of differential diagnosis in a case of meconium ileus. The most common important differential diagnoses are ileal atresia, Hirschsprung disease, small left colon, and meconium plug syndrome. So, ileal atresia we'll generally see as a distal bowel obstruction on plain X-ray, and there will be presence of air fluid levels. And if a microcolon is present, the contrast agent generally will not reflux. But final diagnosis will be on operative intervention. So the left side X-ray could suggest ileal atresia, but as I told, final diagnosis cannot be made preoperatively always. Then second most important DD is a Hirschsprung disease, especially total colonic aganglionosis or extended bowel aganglionosis. It may also mimic as meconium ileus. So definitive diagnosis can be suggested both radiographically and anorectal, that manometry which we don't do in neonates, and final diagnosis will be on the histopathology. But some points which can help us in the diagnosis are a transition zone seen in X-ray, and reflux of contrast into the terminal ileum will typically not demonstrate any filling defects, that pellets of the meconium ileus. Then another next important is neonatal small left colon syndrome. This like on a contrast enema, it will generally be confined on the left side, and there will be funnel shaped tapering on contrast enema. And also important is history. Generally neonatal small left colon syndrome, there will be associated history of maternal diabetes, hyperthyroidism, drug abuse, or eclampsia. Sorry. Then a meconium plug syndrome. This also on contrast edema we can suspect if we can see plugs or casts of meconium, especially in the sigmoid or descending colon. And this syndrome has significant association with other GI anomalies. And the pathogenesis is mainly related to the bowel hypomotility. So it can be seen in association with prematurity, hypotonia, any electrolyte disturbances like hypermagnesemia in children, respiratory distress, sepsis, hypothyroidism, diabetes, or even in a case of Hirschsprung disease. So coming to the management can either be non-operative or operative. So in a case, this is just a gist, then I'll go into the detail. In a high suspicion of meconium ileus, we should first stabilize the child, do the initial evaluation with we can do an X-ray, we can start the antibiotics, monitor vitals, findings which we are suspecting complex meconium ileus, we should directly go ahead with surgery and not waste crucial time in doing other contrast studies. And findings where we feel it's an uncomplicated meconium ileus, we should go ahead with a contrast enema. If there is associated malrotation or other anatomical abnormality, we should also go for upper GI series, and then we'll decide for surgery accordingly. If there is successful treatment, we will keep following the child with serial abdominal radiographs and monitor hydration of the status and monitor for any other issues related. If there is on contrast enema, there is treatment failure or persistent meconium ileus, then we have to again go for surgery. Also, in children who have been successfully treated either by surgery or by non-operative method, on follow-up we have to obtain serum immunoreactive trypsinogen or a sweat chloride test or a DNA testing to rule out cystic fibrosis. So coming to the non-operative management, I'll first of all tell what is Noblet criteria. This is before deciding that we will treat this child with a non-operative non-operative management. So an initial diagnostic contrast enema should be there, which should exclude other distal intestinal obstruction. We should rule out any complications of volvulus, atresias, perforation or peritonitis. The enema should be performed carefully and under fluoroscopic control. IV antibiotics should be covered. The patient definitely should be attended by a pediatric surgeon during the procedure, and should have full fluid resuscitation with fluid given aggressively, like 1 to 3 times maintenance during the procedure. And the patient should be prepared and counseled for imminent operation should any complication develop. So the non-operative treatment we go for is a gastrografin enema or meglumine diatrizoate. It's a hyperosmolar water-soluble radio-opaque solution which contains 0.1% polysorbate. So under fluoroscopic guidance, 50% of this diluted solution is injected per rectally, and we expect spontaneous passage of inspissated meconium. But sorry, before that, under fluoroscopy guidance, when we are seeing, we have to see that contrast has reached the right side of colon and it has reflected into the small bowel. At that time, we can stop it, we can shift the child back to an ICU, and we should wait for spontaneous passage of meconium. And an X-ray is generally repeated after 8 to 12 hours. If there is incomplete evacuation, then we might repeat the same procedure with the same dilution. But if it is successful, then we will follow up the child with we'll start giving 10% N-acetyl-16 6th hourly through NG. And once the child will resume to oral diet, we can give pancreatic enzymes as supplement. But if there is no evacuation, or we were not able to see any reflux into the small bowel, or there is worsening obstruction or signs of perforation, we should immediately take the baby for operative intervention. So advantage of this procedure is that it reduces pulmonary morbidity because of the surgery and a reduced length of hospital stay. Disadvantages is a delay in operative intervention. for those who are unsuccessfully treated by this, or there is a risk of immediate and delayed intestinal injury or perforation because of the procedure or because of the gastrograph in which we are using, and the induction of hypovolemia. Coming to the operative management, simple meconium ileus can be most commonly treated by enterotomy with the irrigation. So the irrigants we use most commonly are as simple as a warm saline or 50% diatrizoate solution, 1% solution of pancreatic enzymes, hydrogen peroxide, or 2 to 4% solution of N-acetylcysteine. We avoid using very high concentrated uh, this irrigants also, because later it might cause hypovolemia, dyselectrolytemia, and there could be air embolism as well. So we have to use this, and the enterotomy which is done can either be closed, or we can bring it out as an enterostomy, or we can leave a T-tube also. So post-operatively, the washes are continued, and by 7 to 14 post-op day generally, we expect that irrigant should pass freely into the colon. After that, if there is a T-tube and all, we can just pull it out and it will close automatically without need for further surgery. An alternative technique for this is doing an appendectomy with appendicostomy, or with meconium evacuation and irrigation, or putting a temporary indwelling tubecostomy. So other options where there is a necrotic bowel scene, or we feel it's difficult to remove it, or bowel is compromised, in that case an alternative procedure is enterotomy, irrigation, and placement of a temporary obstruction relieving stoma with or without an associated partial resection. So the most common procedures which we follow is either a Mikulicz double barrel enterostomy. Um, in this, both the without doing any intra of evacuation, the both the loops of the bowel are exteriorized, and they could be opened after the abdominal incision is closed, so there is no contamination. And after the obstruction is relieved, we can, once the child is stabilized, obstruction is relieved, before discharge we can just crash the spur of this Mikulicz with using a Mikulicz clamp, and this will lead to a side to side anastomosis. Then other option, sorry, second option is a Bishop-Koop procedure. Bishop-Koop procedure is basically where we do a resection coupled with the distal chimney enterostomy. So with the distal lobe brought out, we can use the irrigant and clear off the inspissated meconium. Sir, meeting will end in 5 minutes. After that, we'll rejoin again.
Okay.
Yes, sir. So in Bishop-Koop, we will use the distal bowel loop for the irrigant, and within 12 to 24 hours after the operation, we can use catheter irrigations, for which we can use pancreatic enzyme solutions or N-acetylcysteine, and this should be repeated every 4 to 6 hours and until the distal luminal obstruction is relieved. And this chimney can then be closed either on the bedside, it may be ligated, or we can take the child back to which we follow most commonly is we take the child back to the operation theatre and formally close off the stoma. Um, a little modification of this is the Santulli proximal chimney enterostomy, in which the distal end is anastomosed end to side to the proximal ileum, and proximal ileum is exited as an end enterostomy. So in this also we can pass the irrigation tube into the distal ileum as well and proximal as well, but this needs early closure, it being a proximal stoma. So coming to complicated meconium ileus, it almost always requires an operation, except or rarely when in utero perforation which has left telltale remnant of extraluminal intraperitoneal calcified meconium, or a spontaneously sealed perforation, and when there is no interruption of intestinal continuity postnatally. Another finding for the later process, like this calcification and in utero perforation, is that calcified meconium seen in the patent processus vaginalis during a hernia operation, or or by abdominal radiograph later in life. These things we can, in such cases, we can leave. Otherwise, it always requires a surgery. A word about the meconium pseudocyst. Meconium pseudocyst is actually a result of meconium accumulating in the peritoneal cavity for weeks to months. It is an antenatal bowel perforation. So, there is sterile peritonitis and dystrophic calcification occurs. And a calcified pseudocyst fibrous wall forms, like we can see in the picture. On the left upper quadrant, we can see some specks of calcification, and then eggshell kind of calcification, and the bowel loops are displaced laterally. So there is adhesive meconium peritonitis which follows, and there are dense and vascular adhesions, and all these calcifications can happen. The most common causes of bowel obstruction and perforation include meconium ileus, bowel atresia, and segmental volvulus. Post-operatively, we should support the infant's general physiology. We should evacuate any residual proximal or distal inspissated meconium, and which can be done by installation of 2% or 4% N-acetylcysteine. Enteral nutrition should begin with an elemental formula, and we should start supplementing pancreatic enzymes. If there is post-op ileus, which is prolonged, or if there is short bowel syndrome, we can also start with TPN, total parental nutrition. Vitamin supplementation should be taken care of. Short-term parental antibiotics are needed. Pulmonary physiotherapy is very important with postural drainage in these children because they are already susceptible for pulmonary infections. Stoma care should be taught to the parents before discharge, or stoma should be closed preferably before discharge. And perhaps the most important feature of post-op care is to secure the diagnosis of cystic fibrosis as the cause. Now, complications seen with meconium ileus could be either gastrointestinal, pulmonary, or inguinoscrotal. So, in gastrointestinal, as I mentioned before, there is meconium ileus equivalent or distal intestinal obstruction, which is seen in children and adolescents. So they will present with partial bowel obstruction because uh, there will be a partial bowel obstruction mainly because of intraluminal material, which could be because of steatorrhea or non-compliance with the oral enzyme therapy. So in these cases also, I started with the complications. We were dealing with the first one, distal intestinal obstruction syndrome, seen most commonly in children and adolescents with cystic fibrosis. They present with partial bowel obstruction because of the intraluminal material, which could be because of steatorrhea or because of non-compliance with the oral enzyme therapy. So once the treatment is established, their management is also solubilizing agents, which we can give both orally as well as per rectally. Then there could be appendiceal luminal obstruction, which may present as either acute or chronic appendicitis. Malabsorption is very common. Malabsorption of all carbs, proteins, and fat may occur, and it is worsened by any disaccharidase deficiency or inspissated biliary secretions. It may also be the cause for gallstones formation or biliary dyskinesia seen in these group of children. Then it could be intussusception. Intussusception is seen in 1% of older cystic fibrosis children, and it could be because of the inspissated intraluminal stool, which might serve as a lead point. Most common is ileocolic only. Rectal prolapse may be the first clinical presentation in a child which has not previously been diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. It is typically seen between the ages of 1 and 3 years, and the preferred treatment is oral enzyme therapy, and very rarely only it will require more aggressive treatment like sclerotherapy or operative rectopexy. Then colonic strictures, it could be because of the large dose oral enzyme therapy or because of the washers which we use, sorbate, polysorbate washers. So in this, we need to regulate the enzyme therapy, and if there are intractable strictures, it might require a resection. Coming to the pulmonary complications, it is the cause of early morbidity and mortality in patients with meconium ileus. The worse lung function and more obstructive lung diseases are generally seen between the ages of 8 to 12 years. So, in such children, we prefer prophylactic antibiotics, aggressive physical therapy, and postural drainage. This should be taught to the parents from the beginning only. Inguinoscrotal disease, it has been seen that incidence of inguinal hernias and hydrocele as well as cryptorchidism is increased in patients with cystic fibrosis, and in patients in which it is not diagnosed, two operative findings at the time of hernia may suggest a diagnosis of cystic fibrosis, that is presence of calcified meconium in the hernia sac and the absence of vas deferens. Results of the treatment have we have seen improved outcome for the last 3 decades in both simple and complicated meconium ileus, with survival rate reaching 100% in both operative and non-operative. And there was no significant overall difference in the outcome with regard to the patient gender, whether complication was present or not, and with regard to the type of operation performed. Thank you, sir.
Ravneet?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Uh, Good presentation, and it was really extensive, including both atrasias as well as meconium ileus.
Yes, sir.
Okay. As I have gone through the presentation, so I'll
Yes,
ask
sir.
Ramchandra sir to ask anything that you have skipped, because I have gone through the presentation. So let Ramchandra sir also give his input.
Yes, sir.
Ramchandra sir?
Yeah, first thing I want to ask Ravneet is she okay? She's been coughing throughout the presentation.
No, sir. I
Do
had
you need
mild.
a do you need a swab test?
No, sir. I had mild
You sounded
URTI.
a little you sounded a little breathless also, like President Trump.
No, sir. I'm okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Have you checked your saturation?
Yes, sir. Sir, I had mild URTI starting yesterday. So for that, I'm already
Oh, okay.
taking medicine.
Okay. And now we'll come to the point.
Sir.
First, we'll start with the cystic fibrosis,
Yes,
or we'll
sir.
start with the atresia. Atresia we'll start with first.
Sure,
Okay, in
sir.
atresia, uh, some trivia which needs to be highlighted is about the history of research into atresia. You mentioned the name, that is Lowe and Bernard.
Yes,
So
sir.
that's a very important name to remember, because they were the ones who told us that small bowel atresia is an acquired intrauterine vascular catastrophe which causes the absorption of the bowel and causes atresia. Now, who
Yes,
is
sir.
Bernard? Bernard is the same famous Christian Bernard who, during his surgical residency, worked with the famous Professor Lowe in Cape Town, South Africa, where he did animal experiments in beagle puppies to prove the vascular catastrophe theory for bowel atresia.
Yes, sir. So
And who is,
dog
why is he
fetus.
famous? Why is he famous, Christian Bernard?
Mm, no, sir.
He did the first heart transplantation.
Transplantation,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
One more thing regarding etiology is that with the increasing use of cocaine, even in India, with all this Sushant Singh Rajput thing and all coming out, there is a risk of multiple intestinal atresia in pregnant women who abuse cocaine. Okay,
Yes, sir.
so that is one thing we must remember, and it is very commonly seen in black babies in US. I have seen it myself. Multiple intestinal atresias.
Okay, sir.
Okay, and what is that anastomosis called? Multiple intestinal atresia. It has got an Indian origin, that name.
No, sir.
It's called as the sheikh kebab anastomosis.
Okay,
You know,
sir.
like you put the kebabs on the skewer,
Yes, sir.
that rod. So
Yes.
it's a sheikh kebab anastomosis. That's what it is called. So multiple intestinal loops are strung together, and usually one intraluminal tube is kept to keep the anastomosis patent. Very often we keep that. Many of us would have had multiple atresias once or twice in our entire clinical experience. It's not a very common disease. More commonly seen nowadays in the Western units. Then about tapering, you have mentioned everything. Tapering, jejunoplasty, and usually when you have this apple peel atresia, it is
Yes,
not
sir.
very important to do anything for the apple peel at all. You should not do anything, not touching that apple peel.
Yes,
No
sir.
need to fix it, no need to do anything. You just have to stick two loops of bowl together after tapering and just be done with it. If you do that, minimal surgery, they will do well. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Then one or two points about cystic fibrosis. Meconium ileus, when it comes to meconium ileus, all meconium ileus is not actually cystic fibrosis. There is a entity of meconium ileus in premature babies where they are not having cystic fibrosis. Okay, that we must remember.
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
and that soap bubble sign which you see in the right lower quadrant, it is called as whose name?
Something with N. No.
Neuhauser sign.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Neuhauser sign.
Yes, sir.
And you described Noblet's criteria very beautifully. What else Noblet is known for?
Sir, management in this only, meconium ileus.
No, that is one very important contribution.
Yes, sir.
The first forceps which was developed for the suction biopsy for Hirschsprung's disease, bedside rectal suction biopsy, is
Okay,
called
sir.
as the Noblet forceps. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So important thing to remember is if you have done this procedure of non-operative treatment of meconium ileus, you will know that you usually dilute the gastrographin 1:1. So you use 50% strength. Okay, and you inject it by hand. That is very important. Okay,
Yes,
and
sir.
continuous fluoroscopy is important. That is another important point. Noblet's criteria, and you have to reflux the dye into the distal bowel. That's another important point. Okay.
Yes, sir.
And the fluid management is continuous 1.5 times maintenance. Fluid has to be infused at the time of doing the procedure. Important thing is to avoid hypothermia when you are doing it. So it has to be done within a short period of time. As soon as you see it going, just like you see how you do in hydrostatic reduction, as soon as you see it flushing into the distal small bowel, you immediately stop and you send the baby back to the unit.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then you can start feeding the baby N-acetylcysteine cysteine in the unit. And some of us also give 50% gastrographin orally to the baby. We infuse little bit of gastrographin boluses to the baby to also flush from antigrade this thing for meconium ileus.
Sure, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
And the commonest surgical procedure done for meconium ileus is usually an ileostomy. We don't do all this fancy bishop coupe and all this. Maybe we'll do some T-tube or something, but very commonly ileostomy is done for these cases. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I think Dr. Rajendra Savji and I don't see Vinay, Ravi Kiran, I don't see. So Dr. Rajendra Savji will have a lot of points to mention.
No, you have covered most of them. Couple of points, yes, definitely. First of all, very nice presentation. Very, very good, very exhaustive.
Thank you, sir.
My question is from history to current day implication. What has really made the difference in survival? While preparing this presentation, you must have gone through history also.
Yes, sir.
So in 50s, 50s of last century, the mortality was almost 90-95%. and which has dramatically changed subsequently in 60s to survival rate, 60 or 70s for that matter, up to 78-80% survival. What single most thing has changed this, and which is a good bearing today even as a resident and for everyone, every surgeon who is operating on such anomalies.
Sir, the
I'm,
enemas which we are using?
I'm talking about atresia, small bowel
Oh,
atresia.
atresia.
What single most, if this question is asked to you, what
Yes.
single most technical, I will give you a hint, has made the change? Do you know?
No, sir.
It is the type of anastomosis, that end to back anastomosis,
Yes,
which has
sir.
made tremendous difference. Okay.
Yes, sir.
And of course, then other neonatal care, TPN, antibiotics, etc., etc. But the major difference is made by the technique of anastomosis. And therefore, it is extremely important to carry out that anastomosis very meticulously, very precisely. Second important thing, which presently is not used, but what type of suture material was advised and being used and has got limitations, because of which now we have changed to current suture material usage.
Sir,
Atresia, I'm talking about.
yes, sir. So
Again.
we are using absorbable sutures.
Yes, very good.
Previously, silk was being used, so more chances of
More
infection.
than even proline. If you see literature, the
Yes, sir.
description of proline is very profoundly given. Literature of say 70s and early 80s and all 60s. PDS and proline. PDS came a little later, but proline was very commonly used. Why I am highlighting this point, I have seen at least three children who have grown up subsequently in the say 14, 16, 17 years of age, who came with recurrent fall in the hemoglobin. They were evaluated all for all sort of hematological conditions, etc. The hemoglobin would fall periodically, say twice or thrice in a year in these in these children, up to 4, 5, requiring multiple transfusions. A number of people have seen this, number of people have explored for this thing. The important history everybody missed was the type of suture material used. Proline was very commonly used, and I saw enteroliths. I have 3 cases of enteroliths, and particularly the knots were given inside, and those two sort of tentacle-like suture material after cutting would result into accumulation slowly over like stone formation in urinary tract. Similarly, stone formation occurs at the urinary at anastomotic site. So that will lead to that thing what is called as enterolith is a basically granulation tissue.
Yes, sir.
So there is loss of blood resulting in anemia. So one has to be very careful even if you use silk or any other non-absorbable material. You want to give. Hello.
Yes, sir.
I completed it. You hear it? What I said?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We heard, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
So that is how this interrelates these two things.
Yes, sir.
And another point regarding atresia, I don't know whether it was only for small bowel. You didn't speak about colonic atresia, or did you?
Sir, actually, topic was small bowel.
Okay,
So
okay.
that is why I
In
didn't
the
cover.
completion of thing, yeah. Another thing is suppose if you are given X-ray with a contrast study, barium minima diagnostic, those 3-4 conditions like low bowel, small atresia,
Yes,
small
sir.
bowel, Hirschsprung's, meconium ileus, and congenital left shoulder. What is that sign is called that? Which is almost taken as very close to total colonic ganglionosis.
Sir, microcolon we will see
Yeah,
strings
microcolon in
and
all you will see.
Question mark sign.
Yes, very good. That is the one which, in fact, the X-ray which you have shown and where cystic fibrosis came out as a diagnosis subsequently.
yes, sir.
In that case, you can easily see that question mark sign.
Yes, sir.
So these are the points. As soon as you see this sign, get alerted with so many things in mind. And then, of course, meconium alias and where subsequently cystic fibrosis is being done. Okay. Okay, I think I rest my comments. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Ravneet,
Yes, sir.
just for the completion for other PGTs also, will you just describe the differential diagnosis for microcolon as Rajendra Soji sir was asking? And how do you differentiate atrasias from Hirschsprungs from meconium ileus?
Sir, starting with I'll start with Hirschsprung. In Hirschsprung, especially in total colonic aganglionosis, we'll see a microcolon. We might not see reflux of the contrast into the proximal ileum, and if we see, we can make out a transition zone. So the transition zone can only help us think about Hirschsprung. Then in ileal atresia, if it is a distal ileal atresia, there will be microcolon. And in this also, there will be no reflux of contrast into the distal ileum. And we will see multiple air fluid levels and proximal dilated bowel loops. In congenital small left colon syndrome, we'll see tapering of the tapering of the colon, and it will be mainly restricted towards the left side. And we can also have associated history like I mentioned maternal diabetes and hypertension. All those things will also be there. And in meconium ileus, sir, we can make out the pellets. There'll be microcolon in that also. We can make out pellets of inspissated meconium. Then on reflux of the contrast into the proximal ileum, there also we can make out the pellets. And dilated proximal ileal loop we can see. Air fluid levels will be minimum.
True, true. Basically, in a microcolon, all these present with microcolon. So with that finding, what else extra finding is, if there is a cutoff, complete cutoff of the distal ileum, more in favor of atrasias because nothing
Atresia.
is going beyond it. If it has gone beyond the narrowing, either it might be a long segment Hirschsprungs or it might be
Ileus. Meconium ileus.
meconium ileus. Okay. Meconium ileus, you usually see pellets there, whereas in Hirschsprungs, you usually don't see pellets. And as Ramchandra sir was asking you about the Neuhauser sign, the other sign is also called as soap bubble sign of singleton. So
Yes, sir.
either you call it a singleton or also.
Yes, sir.
I think you have covered most of the
The other
points.
important clue, Vinay,
Sir,
the
sir.
other important clue in microcolon is the morphology of the rectum. Very often, if you carefully examine the morphology of the rectum in the small left colon syndrome, in meconium ileus, in atresia, you will see that the rectum will retain the same ratio as we could retain in a normal person. That the rectum will be more dilated than the sigmoid, but they will all be smaller. But still, the rectum will be wider than the sigmoid.
Okay, sir.
Whereas in total, that is TCA, the rectum, sigmoid, everything will be characterless. So they lose their hostration, the flexures are gone. So it will all look like one question mark. So that is characteristic of TCA. But still the rectum will be narrow in TCA. Whereas in small left colon syndrome, and in that is the meconium plug syndrome, and in atresia as well as in meconium ileus, you will see that the rectum will still be slightly or little wider compared to the rest of the large bowel. You will see that ratio being maintained. That's an important clue to remember, especially when you have done like people like us who grew up with not doing bedside biopsies and all. We had to do lots of contrast studies. So we used to do lots of contrast studies, and that is how we used to differentiate between these various types of low small bowel obstruction, low bowel obstruction actually.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, very good point. What is called as reversal of rectosigmoid index. Otherwise, also when you are facing the problem of a case of constipation, to be differentiated between different causes of constipation, also it is a very useful sign. If the varium minima is done technically perfect. If somebody just pushes with pressure and all these things can be false negative or false positive accordingly. Okay. So reversal of rectosigmoid index is a very, very important clue for you dealing with, because sometimes biopsy experts may not be there, histopathology, then it's not easy to take in newborn, particularly in a sort of not very well preserved baby, to take multiple biopsies and all these things. So these are very important clues. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Ravni, just for the completion,
Yes, sir.
given a choice, which do you want to handle, jejunal atresia or ileal atresia, and why?
Ileal atresias. Better outcome, sir. And jejunal atresias, if it leaks or if it forms a stricture more proximal than anastomosis. And plus jejunal, sir, we have seen in post-op period also delayed recovery, and they'll have uh, mm,
So, in
what
other
to say?
words, give some points in favor of ileal atresia and some points in not so favorable jejunal atresia.
So distal the atresia, better it will be the outcome surgically. And
Uh, Okay, I'll tell you the answer. Basically,
sir,
jejunal atresia, the associated anomalies, starting with associated anomalies, jejunal atresia are almost 40% of jejunal atresia are associated anomalies. Ileal
okay.
atresia usually don't have associated anomalies.
Yes, sir.
So, like the cardiac or the spine or the renal anomalies. So, jejunal atresia are isolated. And usually, late jejunal atresia have much more better prognosis. One, second, as you mentioned, the anastomosis itself. Once it is outside the ligament of Treitz and it's very near to the ligament of Treitz, the anastomosis is such a difficult thing. One, you require tapering. Third, is anything to do with the histopathology of the proximal dilated jejunum?
Yes, sir. The dilated segment will have hyperplasia.
So I told
So,
him,
what minute, sir?
Minuclear is going for the chemotherapy.
Huh,
You
sir.
are
So
going
there will
for
be hyperplasia and all and dilated. So that segment becomes hypoperistaltic and it's ineffective contractions.
Prolonged hyperperistalsis. That's why the tapering, excision surgeries came about. And fourth point is jejunal atresia also present with apple peel atresia. Apple peel atresia historically is considered to have bad prognosis. But as
Yes.
Ramchandra sir said, you don't do anything to the mesentery, you just cut the tip and do the anastomosis.
Yes, sir.
Even we have seen not doing much, just anastomosing. Apple peel atresia also have gone home without much problems.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and jejunal atresia may also present with multiple sausage atresia that are multiple atresia, um, which are also seen in jejunal atresia more commonly than ileal atresia.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Yeah. They are just asking these Viva questions. That's all. Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
Ramchandra sir.
general question I would like to ask. I mean,
Sir.
generally, we were talking about contamination and all those things, and then loop and etc. But meconium is a very sterile structure. I mean, sterile material. So, how long meconium remains sterile in the bowel?
So antenatally it remains sterile.
And
Postnatally, yes, sir.
postnatally, what? So, if you have not fed baby and taken for surgery,
Yes, sir.
so if it's a sterile meconium, you are dealing with, because so many times we talk of contamination, etc. Is it really contaminating? I just want to know. I mean, I also don't know exact answer. How long, unless the feeding is given. Once the feeding is given, probably.
Yes, sir.
Go. But if the feeding is not done, there is no perforation inside, or even if it is there, many of these perforated peritonitis, which are meconium peritonitis, which are otherwise non-obstructing, non-infected, non-pseudosis formation, etc. We just leave them alone, isn't it?
Yes, sir. Mm.
So how long it remains sterile? Would you come across any reference or literature, any like
Uh,
this on this?
I didn't come across it, but I'll definitely search it. If I come to know, I'll definitely just let.
Ramchandra. Yeah.
Yeah, as far as my reading goes, it is 6 to 12 hours. 6 to
Only.
12 hours it takes for the gut to be colonized by bacteria.
Okay.
Because
Means,
aerophagia will occur, even if they don't feed, aerophagia will occur, and with aerophagia, the bacteria will get in.
okay. Mm, okay. Mine,
But more with the feeding, definitely more with feeding. But colonization is known to occur between 6 and 12 hours after birth. That is what is normally known. We can check the references and see.
Yes, sir.
yeah. I mean, I was just thinking about this thing because every time when we open up, we give so much importance. Many times we don't open bowel, we must make stoma, bring it, and then open, etc. So, how long really is it really contaminating type and all? And that type of question.
I think meconium is more chemically irritating than infective.
Yeah.
That's what I feel. Chemically, I think it is highly irritating to the peritoneum.
Yeah. Possibility of disease obstructions and all more likely
Yeah.
if we don't follow that.
Correct.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
So that's why the bad prognosis with giant cystic meconium peritonitis, because
Yeah,
meconium
exactly.
is more irritation to the peritoneum than the concept of infection per se, sir.
Yeah. So urinary ascites does not cause any problem, whereas meconium ascites causes severe problem.
Exactly, sir. Like when we used to do barium reductions for intussusception, and if there was a perforation, the barium would cause a severe reaction to the peritoneum. So it was similar. Meconium also has the same property as the barium to produce irritation of the peritoneum, sir.
Yes. Chemical peritonitis.
Yes, sir.
See, one of the things which uh, has come out in meconium pseudocyst is that if you want to reduce the morbidity of the surgery for meconium pseudocyst, the current recommendation is that you don't disturb the pseudocyst at all. You
Okay.
just leave the pseudocyst, put a drain in it and come out, and just pick up a loop proximally and do a stoma and come out. And then you see what happens later. That is one of the salvage procedures for meconium pseudocyst, because meconium pseudocyst I have seen it is almost like 90% mortality.
True, sir. True, sir. Even as Ravneet presented, she presented one of the mortalities for a meconium peritonitis, which occurs
Yeah.
in
We discussed in the mortality meeting
yes,
also, no?
exactly, sir. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sir,
I think,
can we end the meeting, sir, if there are no other
yeah.
questions?
Please. Thank you.
Okay.
Excellent
Yeah, Ravneet?
presentation and good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ravneet, good presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.